Karen sat in the Willowbrook Police Station's interview room, staring at a motivational poster about community cooperation while Detective Sarah Blake reviewed her file. The irony of the poster wasn't lost on her. Karen had personally nominated Detective Blake for the department's Community Partnership Award just 6 months ago. "Mrs. Weatherby, you're not under arrest," Detective Blake began, "but we need to discuss the chemical incident at your community center." The fire marshal's report lists several potential charges, including reckless endangerment and improper disposal of hazardous materials. Karen's hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. She'd spent the morning fielding calls from lawyers, insurance adjusters, and a particularly aggressive reporter from Channel 7 who seemed determined to turn her into a viral news story. Chemical Karen's Jacuzzi jihad was already trending on social media, complete with ring camera footage of her stumbling through the toxic foam. "I never intended to hurt anyone," Karen said, surprised by how small her voice sounded in the sterile room. "I was just trying to maintain standards. The Hendersons have been flagrantly violating community guidelines, and nobody seemed to care about proper procedures anymore." Detective Blake consulted her notes. The Hendersons filed a formal complaint last month about harassment. 16 citations in 3 weeks, including one for excessive evening recreation when they used the Jacuzzi at 9:47 p.m. "The quiet hours don't start until 10 p.m., Mrs. Weatherby." The weight of her own pettiness settled on Karen's shoulders like a lead blanket. She'd convinced herself that every citation, every violation notice, every neighborhood patrol was about maintaining community standards. But sitting in this interview room, faced with the consequences of her escalating behavior, Karen began to see her actions through different eyes. "When did you first notice problems with the Henderson family?" Detective Blake asked. Karen closed her eyes, remembering. "When they moved in last spring. Their moving truck blocked Mrs. Patterson's driveway for 43 minutes. I timed it. And their landscaping wasn't approved by the architectural committee. They planted lavender instead of the approved ornamental grasses. And that justified 3 years of citations." "It wasn't 3 years," Karen protested. "It was 10 months, and it wasn't just the landscaping. Their Halloween decorations stayed up until November 4th. Their teenage son practices guitar with his bedroom window open. Mrs. Henderson hangs laundry on a line instead of using the community-approved indoor drying methods." Detective Blake set down her pen and leaned forward. "Mrs. Weatherby, I need you to hear what you just said. You've been documenting a family's daily life for 10 months because they hung their laundry outside and played music during legal hours." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Karen felt something crack inside her chest. Not her ribs from yesterday's umbrella collision, but something deeper, the righteous certainty that had carried her through 3 terms as HOA president suddenly seemed as toxic as the bleach foam still staining her favorite blouse. "I was protecting property values," she whispered. "Mrs. Weatherby, the Hendersons are both doctors. They volunteer at the Children's Hospital. Dr. Henderson runs the free clinic downtown, and Mrs. Henderson teaches medical students. Their son, Tyler, the one who was in the ER last night, he's been mowing elderly neighbors' lawns for free all summer." Karen's carefully constructed narrative of the Henderson family as neighborhood menaces crumbled completely. She thought of all the violation notices, all the committee meetings where she presented their infractions as evidence of declining community standards. She turned good people into villains simply because they didn't follow her increasingly arbitrary rules. "What happens now?" Karen asked. "That depends partly on you," Detective Blake replied. "The district attorney is considering charges, but the affected families are more interested in restitution than prosecution. They want their medical bills covered, the community center restored, and a formal apology. And if I refuse, officer, I want to report an act of vandalism," Karen announced before Fire Chief Rodriguez could even remove his helmet. She gestured dramatically toward the still-foaming Jacuzzi, where hazmat-suited firefighters were now testing water samples that glowed an ominous green under their UV lights. "Ma'am, we received reports of a chemical explosion. Were you present when this occurred?" Karen's eye twitched. the same tell that had given her away during the great mailbox paint scandal of 2023. I was conducting my routine evening safety inspection when I discovered this. This environmental terrorism. Clearly, someone has deliberately sabotaged our community amenities. Chief Rodriguez consulted his tablet, and he didn't see anyone suspicious. No unusual activity? Well, Karen said, warming to her theme, the Hendersons have been using the Jacuzzi at highly irregular hours. Just last week, I documented them here past the posted 10 p.m. quiet time. And their teenage son has those friends with the motorcycles. Mrs. Weatherby. The voice came from behind her, cold and sharp as winter wind. Karen turned to find Dr. Patricia Chen, the community's only actual scientist and the bane of Karen's HOA existence. Dr. Chen held a water testing kit and wore the expression of someone who just solved a very simple puzzle. Patricia, I was just telling the chief about your concerns regarding chemical safety protocols. The pH level in this water is 12.8, Dr. Chen interrupted, holding up a test strip that had turned an alarming shade of purple. That's dangerously alkaline. This wasn't vandalism, Karen. Someone poured bleach directly into chlorinated water, a lot of bleach. Karen felt her carefully constructed narrative crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. Well, I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation. There is. Dr. Chen continued relentlessly. Sodium hypochlorite plus existing chloramine creates chlorine gas. Basic chemistry. Whoever did this either has a death wish or doesn't understand that cleaning products aren't toys. Chief Rodriguez was now looking at Karen with the expression typically reserved for people who call 911 because their Wi-Fi is down. Mrs. Weatherby, I need to ask you directly. Did you put anything in this Jacuzzi? The moment stretched like taffy. Karen could feel the eyes of her neighbors, drawn by the sirens and flashing lights, boring into her back. Mrs. Patterson from 42B was definitely filming with her phone. The teenagers from Maple Court were gathered in a cluster, probably texting the entire incident to their group chats with laughing emojis. I may have added some sanitizing solution, Karen finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, for health and safety purposes. The cleanliness standards in this community have become absolutely abysmal. Dr. Chen snorted. Sanitizing solution? Karen, you created a chemical weapon. We're lucky no one was in the water when you decided to play mad scientist. The fire chief was already radioing for additional backup. We're going to need to evacuate the pool area for at least 48 hours while the water cycles completely. This is now a hazmat situation. Karen watched in growing horror as yellow tape began appearing around her beloved community center, the same pool area where she'd hosted 3 successful wine and wine HOA meetings. The same Jacuzzi where she planned to unveil her new neighbor accountability program next Tuesday. This is all a massive overreaction, she protested. I was protecting this community. Do you have any idea how many bacteria can flourish in poorly maintained recreational water features? But nobody was listening anymore. Dr. Chen was consulting with the hazmat team about chemical neutralization procedures. Chief Rodriguez was filling out incident reports that would undoubtedly become public record, and Karen's neighbors were slowly migrating closer, drawn by the irresistible magnetism of someone else's spectacular failure. Tomorrow, she realized with dawning dread, she would have to face the emergency HOA board meeting that was already forming in hushed conversations around the police tape. And for the first time in her 3-term presidency, Karen Weatherby wasn't sure she had enough spin in the world to make this someone else's fault. The emergency board meeting convened at 7 a.m. sharp in Martha Fleming's living room, because the community center remained a crime scene, or as Karen preferred to think of it, temporarily inaccessible due to maintenance procedures. 5 board members sat in a semicircle around Martha's coffee table, their faces ranging from barely concealed amusement to outright hostility. Before we begin, Karen announced, settling into Martha's wingback chair like it was a throne, I want to make it absolutely clear that yesterday's incident was the result of community-wide negligence regarding pool maintenance protocols. Board Treasurer Jim Kowalski nearly choked on his coffee. Karen, you poisoned the hot tub. I enhanced the sanitization process using EPA-approved chemicals. Karen corrected, consulting the notes she'd spent all night preparing. The fact that our current maintenance contractor failed to inform residents about chemical incompatibilities is the real issue here. Secretary Diana Torres looked up from her laptop, where she'd been frantically typing. The fire department's preliminary report says you poured a full cup of undiluted bleach into chlorinated water. That's not enhancement. That's a felony. The room fell silent, except for the tick of Martha's grandmother clock and the distant sound of Karen's political career imploding. She'd weathered the great known controversy of 2022 and survived the driveway pressure washing rebellion of 2024. But chemical warfare was apparently where her neighbors drew the line. I motioned to call for an immediate vote of no confidence, announced board member Robert Hayes, the retired military officer who'd always opposed Karen's aggressive neighborhood improvement strategies. Seconded, said Diana, not even looking up from her typing. Karen's carefully applied morning makeup couldn't hide the panic creeping across her face. You can't be serious. I've dedicated 3 years of my life to improving this community. I've increased property values by 12%. I eliminated the graffiti problem. I single-handedly got the city to install those speed bumps on Elm Street. You also cost us our insurance coverage, Martha pointed out, holding up her phone. I just got off the phone with our carrier. They're dropping us effective immediately. Something about chemical incidents and liability concerns. The words hit Karen like a physical blow. Without insurance, the HOA would be financially ruined. Without the HOA, Willowbrook Estates would descend into chaos. Unkempt lawns, unpainted fences, and worst of all, unregulated lawn ornaments. This is clearly a coordinated attack, Karen said, her voice rising to the pitch she typically reserved for violations involving visible garbage cans. You've all been waiting for an excuse to remove me because you're jealous of my leadership effectiveness. Karen, Jim said gently, you created chlorine gas in a public space. The EPA wants to talk to us. There's a hazmat crew in our community center. Mrs. Patterson's grandson ended up in the ER with respiratory issues because he was skateboarding downwind when you had your little chemistry experiment. For the first time since the Bleach incident, Karen felt genuine remorse flicker through her righteous indignation. She'd heard the ambulance last night, but hadn't connected it to her actions. The Patterson boy was only 14, and despite his habit of riding his skateboard on the sidewalk, a clear covenant violation, he didn't deserve to be collateral damage in her war against the Hendersons. Is Tyler okay? She asked quietly. He'll be fine, Diana said, her voice softening slightly. But his parents are threatening to sue, along with the Hendersons, the Martinez family, and basically everyone who had to evacuate their homes yesterday evening. Karen stared down at her meticulously prepared notes, watching her bullet points blur as tears she refused to shed gathered in her eyes. 3 years of perfect meeting minutes, detailed violation reports, and community improvement initiatives, all undone by one moment of chemical revenge. I resign, she whispered. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Robert Hayes cleared his throat. Karen, we appreciate. I said I resign. Karen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against Martha's hardwood floors. Effective immediately. You can handle the insurance nightmare and the lawsuits and the teenagers with their loud music yourselves. See how well this community functions without proper leadership. She gathered her papers with as much dignity as she could muster and headed for the door. But as her hand touched the doorknob, Martha's voice stopped her. Karen, the police want to speak with you at 9 o'clock. Something about charges. Then you'll likely face criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and a very public trial that will make the current social media situation look like gentle teasing. Karen nodded slowly. Through the interview room's small window, she could see Willowbrook Estates in the distance, her kingdom of perfectly maintained lawns and regulation-compliant mailboxes. For 3 years, she'd ruled that neighborhood with an iron fist wrapped in parliamentary procedure. Now she was about to lose everything, including the respect she'd spent decades building. But maybe, Karen thought as she watched Detective Blake prepare the paperwork, Losing everything was exactly what she needed, because the woman who'd poured bleach into a jacuzzi to spite her neighbors wasn't someone worth being. "I'll pay for everything," she said quietly. "Medical bills, cleanup costs, insurance deductibles, and I'll apologize. Publicly." Detective Blake smiled for the first time since the interview began. "That's a good start, Mrs. Weatherby. But I think you're going to find that rebuilding trust takes a lot longer than destroying it." As Karen signed the preliminary agreement, she wondered if the Hendersons would ever forgive her. More importantly, she wondered if she'd ever forgive herself. Because somewhere between her first violation notice and her last chemical catastrophe, Karen Weatherby had become the very thing she'd always claimed to fight against, a threat to her own community's peace and safety. The question now was whether it was too late to become someone better. Karen Weatherby clutched her measuring cup filled with industrial-strength bleach, staring down at the community jacuzzi like a general surveying a battlefield. The chlorine smell already burning her nostrils should have been her first warning, but Karen had never been one to heed warnings, especially not from her own common sense. "This will show them," she muttered, dumping the entire cup into the bubbling water. "Let's see the Hendersons enjoy their midnight hot tub sessions when they're swimming in pure sanitation." The reaction was immediate and spectacular. The water didn't just bubble, it erupted like a miniature volcano, sending a geyser of toxic foam 3 feet into the air. Karen stumbled backward, her designer sandals slipping on the wet concrete, and crashed directly into the pool furniture she'd spent 3 committee meetings arguing should be Mediterranean-inspired wrought iron, not that tacky plastic nonsense. As she lay tangled in an umbrella, bleach-scented foam raining down on her perfectly styled bob, Karen's phone buzzed. A text from her neighbor. "Did you just blow up the hot tub? The fire department is on the way." Fire department. Karen's blood ran cold. She scrambled to her feet, foam still dripping from her HOA-mandated neutral earth tone blouse, and realized she had approximately 4 minutes to come up with an explanation that wouldn't end with her being banned from her own community center. The irony wasn't lost on her. Karen Weatherby, 3-term president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, destroyer of the very amenity she'd fought to install, the woman who'd issued 17 citations for improper poolside attire, was now standing in a puddle of her own chemical catastrophe, looking like she'd been attacked by a deranged washing machine. But Karen's mind was already racing. She built her reputation on being the kind of HOA president who could spin any disaster into someone else's fault. The Martinez family's Halloween decorations weren't festive. They were property value diminishing ISIS. The Johnsons' garden gnomes weren't whimsical. They were covenant violations masquerading as lawn ornaments. This bleach situation would be no different. By the time the fire trucks arrived, Karen had already mentally drafted 3 incident reports, each more creative than the last. The Hendersons' excessive hot tub usage had clearly destabilized the chemical balance. The maintenance company had obviously provided faulty cleaning instructions. And if all else failed, she blamed the teenagers. There were always teenagers. As sirens wailed in the distance, Karen smoothed her foam-dampened hair and practiced her most indignant expression. She was Karen Weatherby, HOA president and neighborhood watchdog. She didn't create problems, she solved them. Even when those problems involved accidentally turning the community jacuzzi into a low-grade chemical weapon. The first fire truck rounded the corner just as Karen finished fishing the empty bleach container out of the bushes where she'd hastily thrown it. Phase 1 of damage control complete. Phase 2 would require considerably more creativity.